Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, The War for Talent, Our New Normal. I'm Martha Mathers, Head of Research for SBI, and I'm excited to be joined by Nick Toman, author of The Challenger Sale and the Challenger Customer, for a special Q&A at the end of today's session. This research focuses on the issue that we've all faced over the past 6 to 9 months, really the limited talent available in the market and the need to be able to both attract great candidates to your organization, but also retain the ones you have. For today's session, we'll focus specifically on commercial talent and in particular, frontline sellers. In terms of logistics for the session, you can share any technical issues you're experiencing through the chat feature. If you have questions, please use the Q&A panel. We'll take some of those throughout as we make our way through the session. We'll certainly do a deep dive into some of those questions at the end of today's session as well. So with that, let me move forward into our agenda for today. We'll begin by offering a little bit of an overview of what we've seen in the market from a research standpoint. Following that, we'll dive deep into some of the key factors in retaining your top talent. We'll look at how do you attract A players to your organization, and then we'll wrap up with some recommendations and ideas on how to tackle modernizing, formalizing, improving your commercial talent practice. So with that, I am excited to dive in and tell you a little bit more about what we learned. What you see across slide 3 here is an overview of some of the challenges that we've heard across the past couple months in our advisory boards and client conversations as we've engaged with others in the market. Really a number of different challenges that fall into 3 major buckets: capability, capacity, and commitment. So if you think about capability, as companies grow and as their growth initiatives change, their needs change, the talent that they require changes as well. So if you think about capability, there's certainly an area there thinking about, do we have the right people in the right roles? Are we attracting the best possible people? Are we bringing in A player talent? Are we competitive? How do we differentiate ourselves from the competition? Then capacity, do we have enough people? Are our open headcount roles being filled and being filled rapidly? Do we have the right tools and support for our teams to be able to do their jobs? Are we ramping new players to productivity? Does our team have enough time to sell? Just a couple of areas there. And then lastly, commitment, sales team engagement, top performer retention, attrition rates, and the next set of sales leaders to nurture and grow. Well, we're actually going to begin with commitment today, really diving deep into seller engagement, what keeps people engaged and focused in their role and wanting to stay with your organization. From there, we'll talk a little bit about the other 2 as well, but given today's market and the attrition rates that we're seeing, the biggest opportunity for most companies is how do you retain as many A and B players as you possibly can. So the Great Resignation. We had a couple of conversations at the turn of the year around whether it was ending or slowing down, and we haven't really seen that signaled in the market. And so we claim it here, the Great Resignation is here to stay. And recently I was speaking with an independent board director who shared that some of this fluidity might truly be here to stay for the foreseeable future. But we can debate that through the Q&A session a bit as well. And beginning with some data that we identified through our research, we partnered with another organization called the Top Percentile Collective to conduct this research. And really what we aimed to do was look across B2B organizations at quota-carrying sellers and identify what the talent dynamics looked like, what kept people in seat and engaged, and what attracted new people to roles with these organizations. So to begin, average attrition rates of about 27%. This was measured early Q1 2022. When we took a snapshot in Q4, that number was a little bit lower, about 25% or so. Certainly there's a pretty wide range when we look at that dynamic overall. Most companies seem to sit between 15% and 40%. And most companies, when asked to offer commentary, will tell you it's much higher than it was a couple of years back. 12% open headcount. So picture your entire sales force and the amount of headcount that is open, meaning territories might be uncovered. Your team is not at maximum capacity. And then finally, rising pay expectations. This one is a bit anecdotal, but honestly, we've heard so many times from heads of sales that they're paying more for great talent that it truly feels almost quantitative at this point. So seeing an increase in base pay anywhere between 20 and 30% for external hires. We had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with a few heads of sales, and they affirmed that that is not just base pay. They're paying 20 to 30% more base pay. They're also paying 20 to 30% more OTE. So definitely challenging dynamics. We're bringing in top talent and getting it performing quickly is of the utmost importance, as well as keeping the talent that you have. So another question that we wanted to get a sense of is how many people are actually looking at new opportunities. So as you look at slide 5, question your instincts. The punchline is really a vast majority of sellers across different demographics, firmographics, et cetera, are looking. And as you think about what that looks like, on the left-hand side, the majority of sellers are actively seeking new roles. Here we have the percent of surveyed sellers who are job seeking. So we have 600 plus quota carrying reps represented in this research. And when you look at the population of all sellers, about 56% of the total group is job seeking. Now, to give you a little more color on what job seeking is, it means that sellers have engaged in one or more what we call job seeking behaviors. So they've updated their resume. They intend to resign in the next 6 to 12 months. Perhaps they've talked to a recruiter. They've done at least one. More likely, they've done more than one of those particular behaviors. And when you look at high performers or A players, the numbers are really similar. Here we see 57% of A players job seeking. And just to give a little bit of context on how we defined A players or high performers, these were individuals who were at or above their quota and had also received at least one, if not more, company-wide recognitions for their performance as sellers. So certainly lots of ways you could look at that, but that's what we did for purposes of this research. So then we said, okay, if that's the entire population, let's look at those who are satisfied in their current role. Certainly we've been through a turbulent couple of years and that continues, but let's look at people who are happy and engaged with their job. If you look at the top, about 44% of satisfied A players are looking for new opportunities, and 41% of all satisfied sellers are actively looking. So a little bit better there, but still nearly half when you think about sellers who are happy with their work, they're happy with the company, they enjoy their role. You still get a good chunk of people looking around. And then lastly, when we first rolled out some of this data, we heard from a number of thought leaders that the numbers would really concentrate. You'd see more job seeking amongst the millennials, that 25 to 34 demographic. And what's interesting when you look at the data, this shows the proportion of sellers across different age groups who are searching. So yes, 60% of individuals age 25 to 34 are job seeking, but look at age 45 to 54. Here we see 2/3 of that group job seeking, considering new opportunities. We took the opportunity to share that data with a couple of different groups of heads of sales, and their hypotheses were really interesting. Some of them said, well, the markets have been good enough that this group can afford to be a bit more risk averse. Similarly, we heard a couple of individuals who said people in this age group want one more big opportunity. They're looking at management roles. They're looking at leadership positions, looking again to take on a bit more risk at this point in their career. But really interesting to think about that particular demographic who may comprise a huge amount of your kind of quota as you think about growth potential and growth goals for the company job searching. And then if you look at the 35 to 44-year-olds and 55 and above, certainly nearly half of both of those groups looking as well. So we share this data not to be alarmist by any stretch, but just to paint a picture that essentially indicates most people are tuned to the market around them. They're probably looking around. So it certainly benefits your organizations to think about What can we do to reduce some of those behaviors, to boost people's satisfaction with their job, their engagement with their role? And that's exactly what much of this research dug into. So this slide really just outlines exactly what we did overall in terms of focusing on the top client question that you see on the left-hand side. How do we attract and retain top talent to ensure continued growth in 2022? So then if you move across the page with me from left to right, what we did is we went out to a number of different reps. I mentioned before, over 650 quota carrying reps. And we asked them 100-some questions about different aspects of their role in their job, really trying to understand, how did they think about paid time off? How did they think about sales process, compensation, automation, and technology? Really looking pretty comprehensively across how sellers get work done to capture a full picture. What you see under representative questions is just a few. We wanted to give you all a sample here. And then what happens as you continue moving to the right is we did a factor analysis, which really means we took a massive data set and we reduced it down into a more manageable number of categories. Then we could take those categories and to give a little more color as to what a factor is. It is really taking that data, converting it into a smaller set of categories in which all of the variables move together in a statistically significant way. So we took the 8 factors that you see on the page here, and then we tested them against an outcome variable, intent to stay. So this comprised a couple different aspects, but really we wanted to get at both people who are thinking about leaving, what drives you to think about leaving, and taking action to leave, what motivates people to actually move in that direction as well. So that tells you what we did. Next, we'll start to shift into what we learned. So section 2, retaining top sales talent. So I'll begin on this page with the title itself, Compensation Isn't the Path to Victory. And that was really the hypothesis that many had in terms of what will keep your talent in seat and engaged was look at increasing salaries, look at refining your comp plan, think about how you can match some of the offers they may be receiving in the external market. And while I'm sure there's no seller out there that would say no to a greater amount of compensation, what we learned is that it wasn't the thing that was most impactful in terms of keeping sellers engaged and in seat. And so I'll start there. Right in the middle of the page, you see compensation at about 8% of intent to stay. Impactful to be sure, but nowhere near as impactful as some of the darker blue bars that you see over to the right that we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes here. So compensation contains the amount that you're paid, but also different aspects of understanding the comp plan and understanding what others pay for roles like yours. Moving to the left, sales process and tools. This is, does my organization have a sales process and how well do we adhere to it? Sales tech falls in this category. Automating manual activities and tasks, all of that falls within that 8% that you see there. Continuing on to the left, intra-sales culture. This one's interesting because it contrasts a bit with something we'll talk about over on the right. But if you think about intra-sales culture overall, looking at the 8% there, this is how sellers work within their teams. Do they collaborate effectively? Do they trust their leadership team? What does the overall selling culture look like within the organization? Then we see work-life balance, which again looks like a tiny bar, but it's pretty interesting in that each and every one of these factors is made up of a couple of different questions or components that explain the total percentage. Work-life balance, that 7% comes almost entirely from one single component of my manager empowers me to set my own schedule to get work done however I'd like. And so if you think about how you can really optimize work-life balance, it's less about that extra day off or that extra holiday and more about trusting your people to get their work done. And then we see reward and recognition at 2%. The thing I'll add here is, of course, not your entire sales force is seeing some of the rewards and recognitions that your top players would. And so not too surprising that that's a bit smaller. Then if we look over at the right, at the dark blue, a couple things here. One, short-term success path. This is the idea of really having the raw material to succeed. Do I have sufficient pipeline? Is my territory fairly defined? My quota fairly defined? That is nearly 20% of seller intent to stay. Next, broad executive advocacy for sellers. This is not necessarily just the CRO and his or her interactions with sellers. This is the broad executive team, perceiving that they care about sellers, that they prioritize seller feedback, that they are inclusive in kind of sharing with them about company strategy and taking ideas and direction even from sellers. Really, sellers certainly appreciate sales leadership connecting, and I've heard from many of you that you've invested in stay interviews, line level conversations across all roles of the organization. Certainly keep doing that, but think about, as a sales leader, how you can bring in some of your cross-functional peers to those conversations as well, because the data show us here that has a huge impact. Last item, career leverage. This explains almost a third of seller intent to stay. A couple key pieces to hit: visibility into future potential roles with the organization and professional skill development. So as you think about those aspects, that's really sellers thinking about, is this a good place to be for the long term? Do they invest in me and my growth as a professional, number one? But number two, are there career paths so I can continue to accelerate and grow? Maybe move into a position outside of sales, maybe move up from a sales management perspective. But that idea of really understanding what a future could look like and believing that the company is a good place to have that future is huge. Now, there's a couple notes on this page that I'll speak to. I'll start with the one on the right. First, as you think about career leverage, this was not about a short-term or near-term role promotion. It does fall into this category, but it had a pretty tiny impact, whether you'd just been promoted or expected a promotion in the near term. And so certainly a long-term orientation to career leverage. Second, compensation, we've noted here, is less significant for all sellers, but much more important for A players. And we'll see that in just a minute as we continue to move forward through the data. So I'll recap on this page. On the left-hand side, we see what we look at as table stakes retention drivers. At the top, we've said the old playbook is insufficient in today's environment. And I'll tell you all an interesting story. Shared this data with someone who is a thought leader in the sales space, has spent years looking at sales performance. He kind of chuckled and said, the left is where most sales leaders spend all of their time. And while there's truth to that, it's not necessarily time poorly spent. I believe, and we certainly saw with the data, sellers expect that these aspects of the job are in place, that they'll have a decent work-life balance, that they'll join a team that they like and they can see collaborating with, that sales process and compensation are attractive to them. So those pieces have to be in place, but we look at them as table stakes. Sellers expect that those exist. And when you think about where to put your next incremental effort, it's really what you see on the right-hand side, looking at overall short-term success path, and ensuring that sellers see support around them when it comes to getting their work done and really looking to hit their quota. It is executive involvement in engaging with sellers, that idea of advocacy, and it's career leverage. And so really helping sellers grow. And when we talk to companies that emphasize, that do something unique in those areas, those are the companies that see 5% attrition or under 10% attrition, where we would all love to be in today's environment. So certainly, as you think about where your team's next effort might focus, I'd argue that the areas on the right are a good place to be as you think about retention. So here's what I promised in terms of shifting from looking at the impact of each of these factors across all sellers to looking at intent to stay with A players in particular. So the takeaway here, compensation matters more to A players. Yes, you see that clearly in the data at about 20%. However, it matters less than overall career growth as you look to the bottom right here and think about what that looks like. So the findings are pretty strikingly similar to some degree. We see career growth, we see short-term success path, we see broad executive advocacy for sellers, really all critical pieces of the A player experience as well. However, compensation has made its way into this kind of top tier. So we see 4 factors with outsized impact when we look at the seller experience there. Again, broad executive advocacy, compensation, short-term success path, and career growth. One thing I'll add on compensation as well is when we broke down compensation, it was really a little bit less about total pay and a bit more about transparency. The biggest elements impacting this factor, and again, impacting that intent to stay, are 1, do I understand my comp plan and how to maximize it? And then 2, am I aware of what other companies pay for roles like mine? So we took compensation again, and we wanted to break it down a little bit more just to look at how that actually worked. So here you see some of the key factors impacting compensation: maximizing my comp, understanding my comp plan, understanding competitive and market pay as you look down the left-hand side here. And then what we did was we actually took those different aspects. We took the compensation factor for A players, which again, you remember was a little bit bigger. And then for all players. And we wanted to look at the impact of some of these different components on seller intent to stay. What's really interesting as you look down the line here is from an A player standpoint, maximizing my comp actually has the lowest impact on intent to stay within this bucket of compensation. It is understanding the plan and understanding how the market pays for roles like mine that really drives A players' intent to stay when you think about this bucket of compensation aspects. By contrast, when you look at both core performers and lower performers, understanding my plan has a tiny impact, as well as understanding what the market pays. Maximizing my comp is really the biggest driver here. And of course, there's some other aspects with even less impact that we didn't feature on the page, but that comparison really gives an interesting look at how to drive A players and emphasizing each of the components of your comp plan, keeping those to a manageable level, and ensuring that the team understands how to work that plan to their benefit. So a couple of different implications as you look at slide 12 here. We really wanted to take each and every area and working across the page here, think about, okay, across career leverage, across broad executive advocacy for sellers, and across short-term success path, what has the greatest impact overall? So for career leverage, we mentioned as we looked at that particular slide, a couple of key aspects: sales enablement, scope and maturity, frontline manager quality, performance management, and talent development. What we tried to do as you think about each of those aspects is align a couple of questions to consider. So when you think about sales enablement, does your enablement function support activities beyond onboarding? How does the company support professional skill development for tenured sellers? For frontline managers, can your frontline managers have career conversations with their staff? Have you armed them to be able to do more than just a deal review? Similarly, what dedicated programs do your companies offer to support and develop frontline sales managers? And then we talk a little bit about career pathing and overall succession planning as you think about performance management and talent development. So across those different areas, a number of different really interesting questions and conversations you can engage in with your leadership team. Next one, broad executive advocacy for sellers. So here, thinking about executive behavior and engagement with sales. How effectively does your broader set of executives engage with sellers? How does sales leadership support cross-functional engagement with sellers? Are they orchestrating bringing in different stakeholders here? Employee feedback tools and processes, that's a big one as well. How do your CEOs and CROs think about employee engagement and commitment today? That employee engagement survey that perhaps you look at every month or every quarter, does that look at some of the aspects that really impact seller intent to stay? And then how easy is it for sellers to reach and engage with executives? Then finally, short-term success path. Again, this one was made up really of the aspects that are crucial to a seller's day-to-day and their ability to hit their number. So if you think about things like pipeline and fairness in territory and quota development, here we look at some questions around marketing productivity and maturity. What are marketing's pipeline targets? Are they aggressive enough? Sales and marketing coordination. How well do sales and marketing communicate at the front line? And then sales tools and technology and the extent to which they really effectively support sellers. So a lot of different implications here and a lot of good conversations to have with your commercial leadership team. So the next section we dive into is attracting A players to your organization and thinking about how to bring new people in the door. Here, as I shared earlier, compensation makes all the difference. Compensation is really the thing that will bring somebody over the line and help affirm their decision to join your organization. So good to know, absolutely, and important as you think about the type of talent that you need to attract and bring in the door. But to me, this highlights even more clearly the need to keep as many people as you can, given what this will do to your overall cost base as you think about bringing in new, more expensive talent. So the way we looked at the data here is we compared the A players, which is what you see in dark blue, to all reps, all respondents in the light blue. And the results are pretty similar. There's a couple different nuances that I think are worth digging into. And what we did here is we took all of these factors and we asked each respondent who had joined their organization within the past year to do a 100 pennies allocation of what led them to take their new role, to take their new job. You can see far and away increased total earning potential for both A players and all reps was the largest, the most significant driver of that decision to take a new role, more than double the next biggest aspect. For A players, better work-life balance came next. So that's an interesting one, especially when you compare better work-life balance to all reps. That netted 15 pennies for the A players, but only 9 for the broader population. And then the third one for A players was actually a 3-way tie across product and industry, leadership team. So we see that leadership team importance once again, and a higher base salary. By contrast, when you looked at the broader respondent base, or the broader set of respondents, higher base salary was number 2 and a pretty clear winner there, as you see that bright blue in 14, about a third of the way down the page. And then leadership team came in third for this one as well, pretty similar to what the A players shared. So some great data here as you think about your employer branding efforts, as you think about hiring profiles, as you think about what brings new people in the door and will attract them to your organization, a really nice map of things to consider and things to consider emphasizing. I'll make a couple more notes on the bottom. I was surprised to see company vision and strategy as low as it was. By contrast, attractive territory is also low, but my take here is that companies don't do quite enough to be able to showcase the territory that a new seller might have as they come in the door. We've done some really interesting work here at SBI with companies to help them showcase the quality of a territory that a new A player might be coming into as part of the hiring process. So there's some surprises here, but I think there's some opportunities as well as you think about how you could tweak or optimize your hiring strategy for sales overall. So in terms of recommendations and what this means for the long term, we talked a lot about commitment over on the right-hand side of this visual today. But we really see the need for companies to think end-to-end about how they're managing commercial talent and how to really optimize it across the professional life cycle. So using this 3 C's model of capability, capacity, and commitment, how do you bring the right talent in and put that talent in the right role? How do you provide the team with enough time to do their job and develop professionally? And how do you build an environment that's engaging and helps with upward career mobility? All of that, of course, needs great support from sales, HR, and I'd argue other functions, as we saw in the data here. And our team at SBI has certainly supported companies in a lot of depth across all of these areas or individual areas as you're listening today and perhaps thinking, actually, capability is the area where my team has the biggest struggle. What that looks like, I won't highlight in too much depth, but a couple of ideas as to how we've worked with companies across these different aspects. Certainly capability, thinking about long-term talent strategy and plan, candidate value proposition, differentiated hiring process, some of those types of things, capacity, territory optimization, selling time optimization, time to productivity, and then commitment, thinking about enablement, coaching, HiPo programs, and succession planning, not to mention all the areas that we just talked about in a ton of depth as part of this research. And again, just outlining some opportunities. So we have had a number of folks ask to engage with us to understand, what does my engagement look like today? What does my employee lifetime value look like? What does it look like? And so the talent survey or assessment that we just walked through is something that is certainly available if you'd like to consider deploying it with your reps. Certainly just offer a little bit of information within the chat and we can follow up with you directly on how to make that happen and how to be able to give a snapshot as to how your company is performing against those top drivers of intent to stay that we just discussed. So with that, I'd love to open it up for questions. Thank you so far for your time. Excited to dive into some of the things that we've seen coming in through the Q&A. So let's go ahead and transition. And I would love to bring my colleague Nick on the line with me. Thanks, everybody.
Well, thank you, Martha, and welcome to everybody. I am joined here by our senior partner and talent practice leader, John Staples. John, great to have you here for some Q&A.
Thanks, Nick. Happy to be here. Let's jump into it.
So I will let everybody know Martha won't be joining us for the Q&A portion of this. She wasn't able to join us today. So what you heard was a good old-fashioned pre-recording of Martha, but Martha, fantastic job with that. So thank you. Do see a few questions coming in. Firstly, just logistically, if you have questions, go ahead and use that QA box. You can also shoot them over to us via the chat. But go ahead and enter those in there and we'll make sure we get to them. We do have a couple that came in earlier in the presentation privately here, so we'll rattle through a couple of those. I do see my old buddy, Dario Priolo. Dario, good to see you there. You did say, hey, this sounds a lot like HR. Are you seeing better partnerships with HR and sales? I see, hey, back to you. Is HR gaining credibility? Maybe, John, you know what, I'll hand it over to you and just maybe you can give us a sense. What are you seeing in terms of functional interlock with HR, with sales? It is feeling a little, I don't want to say HR-esque, but I think the issue of human capital is really coming to the forefront through this whole great resignation period. But commentary. Yeah,
I mean, first of all, yes, we're seeing much better partnerships between sales and HR, and that's because it's no longer, it's a complete selling motion right now when it comes to attracting and retaining A-player talent. So by default, HR and sales need to be better equipped, be able to tell a better story, because you're trying to convince some of these A players to come and join your team. when they may or may not be doing well where they are, but there's a lot of other options in the marketplace. So yes, on that one.
And what I'll add to that is just going back to the point Martha made on career leverage. And I want to be really clear on this point. It's something you're probably going to hear from me a few times through this Q&A is thinking less about developing talent for the here and now in your business and thinking about sort of, it gets back to the old WIFMs and what's in it for them over time. And I use this word employability.
Yep.
How do you make your talent more employable? And for some folks, they say, geez, you're telling me, Nick, we got to develop talent that's going to go out there on the open market and leave us quickly. And I would say, you know what, there's an element of, yeah, you're going to develop talent that probably will leave at some point. But if you can get an incremental year, incremental 18 months, because you're helping them build that career, that's particularly productive time that you have those sellers in seat. And, HR functions do think about building talent in that way. And I think in sales, oftentimes we're kind of here and now and maybe not thinking so far forward. So really good question there.
Yeah. Hey, maybe an and on that one. So as we saw at the beginning of the presentation around capabilities, it was around closing A players. So if we think about closing big deals, we have a deal desk for closing big deals. You need to have a deal desk around closing on the A players because they have so many options. And we know how critical it is to get those A players on board and what the impact they have on the overall business is. So retaining, obviously, your A players is critical, but attracting new A players and getting them on board quickly is also critical.
Yeah. Really good questions coming in here. So I'm going to try to keep up with these. We did have one quick tactical one. Tony, thank you. Does your sample include nonprofits? No, it did not include non-for-profits. These were all for-profit businesses in this particular sample. If you have questions on kind of non-for-profit realm, feel free to shoot me a note and we can try to take that offline. From Chris and John, I'll read this one to you. I'm curious for your thoughts on this one. It's a really good question. If winning on compensation is a challenge, what other employee benefits have you seen move the needle on retention? And maybe, I don't know what you're seeing in terms of creative use of LTIs. It doesn't necessarily need to be equity. In some cases, It may be equity, but there may be other creative options where, you're seeing folks start to pull the trigger on something we're calling, just kind of this idea of holding power. How can you exercise some financial holding power over particular great A player talent?
Yeah, the number one by far and away is long-term incentives of some sorts, especially when it comes to your top talent. I mean, we all know that making the number relies heavily on the top talent that we have in the organization. If we lose a significant amount of them, and as we saw earlier in the data, 44% of your A players are out actively looking. If I think about that, and then the data also supported 16% turnover in the A players. Just think about your own organization and losing 16% of your A players. You just can't have that and still make the number at the end of the day. So most of the clients that we're dealing with have some sort of long-term incentive in place, especially for their top talent.
Yeah, and that could take the form, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be equity. I think our mind often goes to equity as sort of the only sole LTI. And in some cases, it may be worthwhile, given the talent profile. In other cases, there may be sort of profit sharing arrangements or other creative approaches you could put in place, right?
Absolutely. And that also means they're making their number consistently over the next few years. But if they're continuing to perform like they have been, there is significant bonus money typically attributed to them.
And Mark, you raised a hot button issue here. Mark says there's a lot of speculation about the true role of the seller 5 to 10 years down the line with e-commerce coming online, automated solutions. What's really interesting, Mark, in my previous life, I ran a research team, and one of my researchers made a comment and put a public post out there saying in 5 years we'd see the death of B2B sales, and I about had his hide. I got to tell you, one, if you follow any of the sort of BLS, Bureau of Labor statistics here in the U.S. and any other sort of equivalents globally, one, there's more sales jobs now than there ever has been. Now, that's not to say that the nature of selling is the same as it is now relative to, say, 5-10 years ago. Sure, we're seeing changes in how sales is happening, and we're seeing digital playing a much bigger role. But really, what we're seeing is more of a particularly in kind of the markets we work in, tech, business services, logistics, manufacturing. It's much more side-by-side selling motion where digital isn't taking over the sales process. We're seeing full funnel marketing where the digital interactions happen throughout the entirety of the buying journey, but sellers are there to help encourage and engage customers with those digital capabilities. So, do I buy into this whole fact that, sellers are sort of disappearing and we're going the age of the dinosaur? well, look around and see how many openings you guys each have in your companies right now. And I think you begin to answer the question. There is tremendous amount of supply. We're struggling with demand right now. And that's the biggest issue. John, I don't know if you have any thoughts against that.
Yeah, over the last couple of years, we're essentially our enterprise reps out in the field. They're weren't out in the field. They're starting to get a little bit back in the field right now. But the people that struggle the most are the ones that were, let me take you to dinner. Let me take you out to golf. They're more social sellers and account developers. Those are the people we've found to be the ones that have struggled the most. Now, many of them have made the turn and others have not. And that's where clients are focusing on trying to backfill those folks that haven't made the turn. But after being 2 years into this, people are already solving for that right now.
There's a really good question here, and I'm trying to keep up with all these. They're fast and furious, but looks like it's from Hugh. And John, you and I were talking about this just this morning. If the A players are overachieving on quota, right? They're making their number, they're making good money. They got the tools and support they need. They're loved at their companies, right? Everybody puts their arms around those A players. We all know who they are. Why are 44% of them, particularly at 44% that are satisfied? Why are they still looking right now? What is going on there?
Yeah, and in this particular case, I think, and the point here is made also around other managers not close enough to them. Not often are the managers close to it, but earlier in the data set that Martha reviewed, 20 to 30% comp improvements. I mean, everybody's going to look if somebody's dangling a 30% improvement, and they're dangling, hey, better conditions for selling, better tools, better enablement, better potential, and probably the most important is better, more balanced territories within their firms, because an A play will drain the lake and know when going into the next year whether there's enough potential in their patch to make the number. If you don't supply additional potential for that A player, they will go and they'll entertain other opportunities and perhaps leave.
Yeah, and A players just so happen to know their territories pretty darn well, don't they?
Yeah.
So absolutely, and it gets back to that point on that short term sort of viability of their patch. I think this is considerably important. And right now, I don't know that we are necessarily obsessing over that enough. On the related point around managers, let's just talk about FLSMs for a minute here. I'm kind of curious. Do you think the old adage still holds true that sellers will leave bad managers? They don't necessarily leave companies. What's your thought on that right now?
Yeah, most definitely. All of the things that the data supported really are controlled by those field level sales managers. They control the culture of the company. They drill it down into those reps. They have more frequent interactions with them. If I don't look at my sales manager as a leader, someone who's making me better year over year, investing my growth in my career, then I'm going to look for someone who can. We've all had really bad managers, and we know how disappointing that can be. And we've all had great leaders who have advanced our careers. They're all looking for those great leaders, and they will leave if they don't feel like they have one.
Yeah, and what I'm seeing right now, we're in this really interesting sort of middle ground. There's almost this gap in true managerial leadership. And what I mean by that is we've had such rampant changes inside companies, such rampant turnover. If you look at your sales force of 5 years ago relative to today, a lot of you may have over 100% churn from 5 years ago to today. Like, you've turned over everything. With that, the managers as well. And what we're seeing is a lot of field promotions. You know what I mean? Where kind of out in the field, someone, guess what, up and leaves. And we kind of look around and say, okay, well, we need someone to manage that territory. Let's pick Jane, let's pick Johnny, move them up into that field, through a field promotion. What's interesting is Jane and Johnny may have great eye for the analytics. They may have a great eye for the data. They understand what's happening in the territory really well, which is why they get the field promotion, but they're really lacking in those intangible leadership qualities, pushing the talent, really developing the talent, saying, hey, let's go do the ride along, virtual or live, whatever that may be. And just those core behaviors, to me, it's very remarkable as a student of watching sort of commercial behaviors over the last 20 years. I am just seeing a considerable gap in the coaching and true, what I would just call leadership discipline out there with FLSMs. And I think that's beginning to show here. People just don't feel supported at that sort of one click up from where they operate.
I mean, those clients and folks that we talk to in the marketplace that are having lower turnover than the 27% that we showed in the earlier data, those folks have programs in place to develop those frontline managers and managers across the board, just to be able to focus on those retention-based opportunities that we identified in the research. So great companies are investing in their frontline managers because, as Nick pointed out, they're not naturally trained to be great leaders. Because they were great reps doesn't make them a great leader. And we all know that from our experience. But companies that are doing well are spending the time to invest in those leaders because they know how critical they are to not only retention, but also implementing the programs and the changes that the clients are putting in place.
Yeah, and good question here from John, and we'll change gears for just a minute. John, I hadn't seen this stat, but you're citing a stat that says 72% of workers that quit during the Great Resignation are regretting that decision. John, if you wouldn't mind, stick that in the chat where you got that, because I'd love to follow up on it. But it's interesting you say that, because I think in many cases what we're seeing in our data is that right now sellers don't have a good view of what things look like sort of over the horizon. In other words, they're not sure if their comp plan is on parity relative to the market. So when you're not sure of something, what do? You go ask questions, you go test the market. And excuse me, and invariably things look good because people are going to paint a pretty rosy picture. And sort of you leave that day-to-day workflow you're used to, you leave that network you've built, you leave those clients that you've built, things begin to kind of fall apart potentially. The biggest thing I would say, if you're a CRO or you're a sales manager, or whatever your role is right now, help provide some transparency. If you've done a recent comp benchmarking, share the results with your teams, show them, in fact, you are at parity, or if you're not and you know it, help express what you're doing to get back to market parity. You've got to communicate this and provide some transparency, because if you're not doing it, guess who's going to go do it? The front line's going to go do it themselves.
Yeah, maybe just one to add on to that one. There's a ton of change happening in the marketplace, and companies that are doing this well are over communicating. If you leave it up to the frontline reps or the frontline sales managers to think, they're going to think about the worst case scenario, and they're going to look and entertain other opportunities. The more you can communicate, the better. We just went through a major change from an on-prem to a SaaS model. And the company was religious about their communication style out to the front line, because they didn't want to lose people in that transition, because it's a new selling motion. So when you introduce something new, whether you introduce an M&A opportunity or what have you, people start to be concerned and wonder whether they're going to be in the new company or not. The more you communicate, the better.
Yep. And Chris, great question here. Any hacks on spotting A players besides impressive CVs? Chris, I'm going to turn that question on its head for a minute. Maybe John will answer your question. I'm going to answer a different question, which is, should we really be thinking about bringing in external A players? And it kind of, it sort of goes in the space of an interesting strategic question around build versus buy. Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing right now is that built talent. In other words, starting them in kind of the SDR, BDR path, maybe moving them into kind of that junior AE type of role, then progressing them up into, a little bit more prominent sales role. That sort of build approach, one, we're seeing the talent is far more engaged. Two, we're seeing that they stay longer with the company. Three, we're seeing some of the assumptions around, well, if I hire talent in and I bring in a star, I know that they're going to ramp in like 3 months, right? They just know how to sell these kind of products. They got the industry experience. They're going to ramp very quickly within, say, 3 months. What we're finding is that, one, the talent externally doesn't ramp that fast. And generally speaking, kind of the rule of thumb, and we're happy to work with you for your company and sort of your situation. And we've built a really cool tool that will help you actually model the economics around this. But generally speaking, unless you can, one, source that talent in less than 3 months, and two, ramp that talent in less than about 3 to 4 months, generally speaking, it makes more sense to have uplift from within the organization and to build within. You get more productivity over time. And yes, you may not be lifting, promoting that quote unquote, that A player, but when you look at it on a total economic basis, you're going to get fantastic productivity very quickly. You're going to place them into a territory very quickly. And net from an economic standpoint, that's actually a bet I would place 9 times out of 10 than hiring that external star. Yep. So I don't know, John, if you have a different
maybe
thought.
2 points on that one. Number one, I would take advantage of the surveying your company and getting the pulse on yours. Yes, this is market research and it's great, but there's nothing like having an internal survey to understand the opportunities that you have within your organization to solve some of these problems. So a nice anonymous survey gets you that. To answer Chris's question specifically, I think the best practice that we see is all around a job trial of some sort incorporated in your hiring process. Yes, I can look at the CV, but we all know what's going to be written on there. It's going to paint this rosy picture of my past successes. But the job trial is how we have separated A's from B's from C's. So think about incorporating a job trial of some sort into your hiring process, and that'll help you, separate A's from B's from C's.
Yeah, really good point. Really good point. Here's another question. I think this is good for a lot of you in kind of smaller businesses, maybe sort of mid-sized businesses. Large companies are throwing quite a bit of cash at candidates these days and pulling them in. And I know we're hearing about certain companies that are we'll keep them nameless, protect the potential guilty ones here. But we know some companies are really throwing some sizable offers out there in the marketplace, and it is becoming harder as a smaller company to bring in great talent. I don't know, John, if you've seen smaller organizations having some luck. I'll mention one tactical thing, and then I'd be curious for your thoughts. I think you've got a lot more experience recently helping companies with some of these problems, but we're seeing even creative approaches to sharing the territory quality with candidates as part of the recruiting process. What do I mean by that? Well, in many cases, candidates know I'm probably getting some sort of reconstituted territory because, some seller left, but guess what? The best accounts, the best opportunities get instantly pushed over to existing sales talent. They don't want to leave those opportunities unwatched. And so I'm getting essentially, there's kind of that old trading process. I'm getting the dregs of what everybody left behind. It's going to be a really difficult territory to work on, to rebuild, to push it into a healthy state. What we're seeing companies do in some cases now is actually, one, holding the line on not allowing that to occur because they know they have to bring talent in. Two, very clearly and explicitly sharing what are the assumptions around how that territory should in fact work, and helping someone who's coming in from the outside understand just how this is a good, clean, well-functioning territory for them to drop into. And they're competing on the merits of the territory. And what's really interesting is suddenly that begins to lower the burden on the compensation itself, where someone can say, hey, short term, I see a really good patch here I can inherit. And guess what? I know that on the variable side of it, I'm going to make my coin if I have a good, healthy territory. So sharing some of that. So really tactical thing, but I think an important part of the recruiting process. John, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think a small company has a lot of advantages. And I think some of those advantages also fall into your point, Nick, around territory potential. If I'm a high growth small company and I'm an A player looking at that small company, I'm selling on the fact that we're at a high growth company. You're an A player. You can come in and easily take advantage of our accelerators over 100% and make even more money and be part of a long-term growth of the company. And maybe that includes equity, maybe it doesn't. I think other components under the table stakes sections, things like company culture, I would emphasize that when trying to attract A players. Smaller companies, higher opportunity, the ability to actually shape the culture of the sales organization is also something that was found in the table stakes section. But if you don't have the table stakes, you got to work on those before you think about some of the things on the right-hand side of the chart that Martha shared earlier.
Yeah, really good. So John, just to make sure we kind of wrap on time, and I know you and I will probably have some long-winded last commentary here. I guess what would be sort of the action you'd recommend that most of the folks listening in take right now? What is sort of the most important thing they can be doing right now to understand what's happening in their business?
Yeah, I would probably just take advantage of the survey and getting an understanding of the pulse of my organization, because as I said earlier, it's great to have the external market data, but it's even more valuable to really understand the current state of your organization and where everybody's heads are at. That would be number one. Number two, I would be taking a really close look at my A players, be very concerned about a possible 16% attrition of my A players. And I would try to look at various programs that you can put in place to keep those A players on board. Most companies we deal with, if you lose 16% of your A players, you've got no chance to make the number. And that's what we're all about, making the number.
Really good point. And I'll say from my vantage point here, and just in kind of closing us out, looking through the survey data we collected, there's a lot of variability company to company. You've really got to understand what does the sort of composite picture of my operating conditions, of my employment value prop, of the culture we're running, of how well the executive team supports the sellers. You've really got to have a good understanding of that. You can speculate. I will say it is tough to get those perceptions really nailed down unless you just go out and ask the sellers. This is sort of an unusual tool in that we're offering the survey up just for sort of general consumption. One, because frankly, we want the data. We want to understand more and more of how this is trending and how it's behaving over time as we see the labor market conditions kind of change pretty dramatically here. So for us, this makes a lot of sense, but for you, you get a lot of fantastic value. So again, just note in the chat box, if you're interested in that, we will make sure we follow up with you around details to deploy the survey. The second thing that I would mention, and this is maybe not so much a near-term action, but something I've been beginning to see a lot more questions around the role of enablement. And if we look at what happened over the past, let's call it 2 years with the pandemic, what was sort of the first function to get a lot of budgets shut down? Well, marketing kind of went first, right? All our trade shows fell off the map and we redirected some marketing expense into digital channels. But the next thing to fall off was enablement. We gutted our enablement programs. And for some of you, that may be a person that are listening. For some of you, it may be big departments, but really beginning to reinvest. And Martha made the point, is enablement just doing onboarding right now? In many cases, it's you're having so much hiring you're trying to do. It's a lot of onboarding. We've lost sight of the professional development in really taking that enablement organization and kind of reinvesting and recommitting to building our talent, going back to that build versus buy. So I would say, thinking a little bit longer term, maybe a year out, beginning to think about what do we need to do from an enablement standpoint? What's that roadmap look like? Where are we deficient? There's some real return to be had there running enablement organizations the right way. So again, a conversation John and I would love to have if anybody's interested. So
yeah, maybe just to add on to that, if you don't have a playbook that is designed around each of your competitors, maybe 4 or 5 competitors, maybe 4 or 5 plays that if you run against that competitor, that you increase the likelihood to win. If you're not handing that to the sales team, especially since you've got a lot of new hires, you're onboarding a lot of folks, you've got to make it simple, stupid. So we've all heard about the KISS approach. If you're not applying that and giving them the playbook and how to run those plays, then you're expecting them to create those plays and run them on your own, and you're likely to be disappointed.
Really good advice. So with that, everybody, thank you for joining in. Again, please let us know if you'd like to take the survey. If we can be helpful in any other way, go ahead and put it in the chat. We will follow up happily. With that, everybody have a great day and thank you for joining in.